Good evening. It's really a great honor to be here, honoring one of the true heroes in my life. I was in Philadelphia yesterday, so I'm not sure what time it is or what day it is. I slept in a certain way. I got a very stiff neck. Either that or I swallowed that Viagra too slow. I don't know. It's one or the other. That's just passing around the room over here. So, see if I won't go into that. The inspiration for this evening was, oh my goodness, hello up there. Hey, thanks for being here. The inspiration for this evening it took place a couple of months ago. I got a telephone call from a very close friend of Ram Dass and asked me if I would join them for a dinner over in Wailea. And I had actually never personally spent any time with Ram Dass. I go back in my life and think about the people who were most instrumental in helping me to shift my consciousness away from the field of psychology and into the field of spirituality. And I came across a tape of Ram Dass's that was recorded up in San Francisco back in the 1960s when I was in my 20s. And he had such a disarming quality about him that I started listening to all of his tapes. And whenever he would lecture, I would go and be in the audience. And then I wrote a book back in 1975 called Erroneous Zones, which was sort of put me out into that spotlight. And I began to be coveted as a speaker in various venues all over the world because that book just took off and was such a huge success. So I was doing this work that I'm doing here tonight, which isn't really work. It's just such a joy and a treat to be here and to be in front of any audience. But the person who always set a model, set a tone for how to do this. I remember the first time I was ever to speak without notes. It was in Houston, and I had written Erroneous Zones, and there were a couple of thousand people. And the man who was introducing me had purchased the book, and rather his wife had purchased the book, and she was in bed, and he looked into the bedroom and he saw her reading this book, and he just glanced at the title and then saw her sitting there, or lying there, and he thought to himself, this is going to be a pretty good evening. And so he went about, he said, this is how he introduced me, he went about closing up the house and got some Banaka and, checked his armpits and did all of the things that you do when you're getting ready to get into bed. And he said, I got into bed and I turned out the lights and I snuggled up to my wife, and she started talking to me about my attitude. He said it wasn't what I had in mind at all. And that particular day was the first day that I had ever spoken to a large audience without notes. And it wasn't because I was taking a risk. It was because as I was being introduced and I was standing over here in the wings, I reached into my jacket pocket and I realized that I had left my notes all carefully orchestrated and all put up, very lined up exactly the way I wanted them. I had left them back in the hotel room. And I had about 3 hours to speak in front of this audience. But I had been listening to Ram Dass tell his stories and speak about what it was that was so vital to him and what it meant to him to leave behind the world that he had been born into and raised into. He was a Harvard professor in psychology and had been raised in a Jewish family. He now calls himself a Hindu, which I like, having spent so much time in India. And to have the courage to leave behind that world, the world of academia. And I too had been a college professor in New York, and remember so strongly the day that I walked into the dean's office and decided that I was no longer going to do this. That I had done it now for 6 years and I wanted to do something else. Now, going to India wasn't what I wanted to do, but I wanted to write, and I wanted to get to that place where I have spoken about so many times, where you don't die wondering. You don't die with your music still in you. And I knew I had music to play and things to say, and I knew that staying in a university setting where I had a guaranteed tenure for the rest of my life, something inside me didn't set quite right. And I remember driving down the Long Island Expressway and thinking about what it was going to be like to go in and resign after I had just been promoted and just been granted tenure. And the dean's name was Sarah Fassenmeyer, I remember, and she spoke to me about being the star here and what you can do and what this university could mean to you. And I was so clear and it was so sure that what the step that I was taking, even though I had no idea how I was going to make a living and what I was going to do, all I knew was I wanted to write, and I had things I wanted to say, and I wanted to do it on my terms, and I didn't want to report to somebody, and I didn't want to have a parking spot, the same spot, over and over again, and I didn't want to wear a suit and tie to work, and I didn't want to have my life scheduled by all of these kinds of things that I had sort of been thrust into through my studies and so on. And that first tape I ever heard of Ram Dass was so powerfully motivating for me to get to that place in your life where you know that you're not going to end your journey in this incarnation and say what Ivan Illich said in Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Illich, as he laid on his deathbed and looked up into his wife's eyes, this woman whom he despised, the job that he despised, the place that he had to go every day that he despised, because he felt that he was living a life that someone else had programmed for him. And as he was lying on his deathbed and looked up into her eyes and said, "What if my whole life has been wrong?" And then he died. That was Tolstoy. And that just gave me shivers. It became one of what I call the 10 Secrets for Success and Inner Peace, in a book that I wrote for my children. I have 8 of them. 8 children, not 8 books. And truly, I mean, when people talk about paying tribute to people, all of you here tonight, all of you up there in the balcony, all of you here, are really here. You're characters in my dream. Because that night that I had dinner with Ram Dass for the first time and found out that there were financial considerations that that were very troublesome to me. That here was a man who had spent his entire life giving the proceeds to his books to charities and not taking speaking fees, and always in service, always in service, always in service. And then I had heard that he had had this stroke, semi-debilitating stroke in 1997. But and you know, I always knew that there was a very powerful connection between this man and myself. In fact, we even look alike. People say we could put our heads together and make an ass of ourselves. Well, and you'll hear that a little later on tonight. But people always would ask me if he was my brother, my older brother, of course. And people, when they would hear me speak, they would say, "Do you know Ram Dass?" And I'd say, "No, I don't know him, but I listen to him and I follow him, and when he speaks, I go and I quote him. I've been quoting him as long as I can remember. His humor is divine. His soul is so connected to me, and I really feel that his guru, Neem Karoli Baba in India, is orchestrating all of this. I do. And I've said this to Ram Dass, and he said it back to me. He just smiles with that knowing kind of smile, that because he told him, feed people. And he told him, love people and love God. And almost as if he was saying, but, you know, in Ram Dass I could hear that, you know, that Jewish professor from Harvard saying, well, wait a minute, I wrote a book here. Be Here Now, the signature book, the classic book on raising consciousness and spirituality and what it means in bringing the East to the West, and the ideas of those great spiritual teachers whom he could quote by the hundreds with his brilliant mind of his. And his approach with his humor and with and I almost feel as if his guru was saying, don't worry about it. I mean, I've spoken about this many times, saying it's like have a vibrational match to what it is that you want to create. Whatever it is that you want to create, offer up to that an energy that matches it. And it's almost as if his divine teacher in India was saying, I'll take care of this. You just do what I told you to do. You just feed people. You just love people. You just love God. You just do that. And somehow, I've always had a knowing that I would be a part of Ram Dass's life in a very personal and profound way for me. And it's absolutely come to pass. And I know that Maharaji is handling all of this in perfect and divine order. And your being here is a part of that order. Now, a few years ago, I put out, maybe 10 years ago now, I put out a meditation CD now. It was taught to me by a teacher in India named Sri Guruji. And it was based upon the teachings of Patanjali back in the 3rd century before Christ, 300 years before Christ. And the meditation is called japa. And we called it Meditations for Manifesting. And it's really about repeating the sound of the name of God as a way to come to God, using this inner mantra of the sound that's in the name of God. And if you look in the book of John in the New Testament, in the opening line, it says, in the beginning, what was the Word? And the Word was with God. And the Word was God. So the repetition of this sound, this japa meditation, I did it, and it was, these astounding things began to happen in my life. And these crazy miracles and people showing up. And I came to a conclusion about how you can use this meditative process through the repetition of a sound to manifest and attract into your life whatever you put your attention on. And as I said, Patanjali was speaking about this shortly after people were crawling out of caves. And Ram Dass came to the same conclusion, but he just did it in a different way. And that's in the time that I have here with you before I bring Ram Dass out, I just kind of want to share with you sort of how I grew up in Detroit. Detroit. And one of the great lines I heard from Ram Dass, and used it many times, always crediting him, of course, and it was from his guru, when he went to India, and he took with him some psychedelic assistants that he was going to employ while he was there in India, because, as you know, Ram Dass was with Timothy Leary and experimenting with alternate states of consciousness. These are all euphemisms. And so he had taken a sizable number of these that would, as he put it, be enough to put an elephant into orbit. And he had them tucked away in a very safe place. And his guru said to him, "You have brought some funny medicine with you." He said, "Give it to me." And as I remember him telling the story, he gave him the 3 or 4 capsules, which you just took 1 little microgram out each time. And he took the whole capsules, all 4 of them, and he handed them to him. And this divine being went under the cover, under the blanket, and took the 4 capsules, or whatever number it was, and swallowed them, all of them, at once. And asked him, "They don't seem to be working. Do you have any more?" And he said he sat there in just astonishment. And then he came to this conclusion that if you're already in Detroit, you don't have to take a bus to get there. That's the kind of humor. I think the all-time favorite story that Ram Dass told, I'm going to let Ram Dass tell it in the way he told it. It's a story of him doing his meditation, repeating the name of Krishna, driving across the New York Thruway. It's what he calls a golden oldie. It's about 6 minutes, and I'd just like you to listen to this. I have 3 excerpts that I've spent the whole day after getting here from Philadelphia going through my old tapes of Ram Dass to pick out 3 that I think are representative of the humor and the intellect, the spirit of this man that I love so much. Would you play the first excerpt for me, please?
So incredibly sweet. I hesitate to tell this story because it's my oldest, goldenest story. Some of you already know what it's going to be, but I can't resist. I just can't resist. I love it so much. In 1970, mid-70s, I guess, I was driving across the country in an old Buick limousine that I had made into a camper. It was a big black 38 limousine. I had just set out from Boston for California, and I knew I had 2 weeks ahead of me of driving this 6,000-pound car. It was just lovely. And I had one leg up under me, and I was on the New York Thruway, and I was saying the names of God. And different names at different times on the journey, but at this point I was saying the name of Krishna. Krishna, at a certain stage, was this teenage youth that was blue in color. And everybody just fell in love with him the minute they saw him. So I was doing Krishna, Krishna, Hare Krishna, 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 Krishna. And I just kept enough consciousness to keep the steering wheel on the road, and I just looked forward to 2 weeks of singing to God and driving across. See, are you driving across the country or are you singing to God? Which one are you doing? So I was singing to God, and I was in quite an ecstatic state, and I looked into my rearview mirror, and there was this blue light. Okay? And the first thought was, he's come. Okay? But, of course, I also realized, because there was enough of me down, that this was a state trooper. So I pulled the car over, and this being came up to the window. And he said, "May I see your license and registration?" Now, in the state of mind I was in, see, what I thought was, my God, he's come. He's come as a state trooper. I mean, after all, Christ came as a carpenter. How do you know how in the 70s Krishna would come? Why not a state trooper? So, sure, you want my license and registration? Take my life. What do you want? Of course. So I gave him my license and registration. I'm looking at him with such love. I mean, can you imagine having the darshan of God? He just comes up to the window and says, "Can I see your license and registration?" So he walks around the car, and he goes back and he calls home, or whatever he does on his radio. And then he came back and he said, "What's in that box on the seat?" And I said, "They're mints. Would you like one?" And what I was trying to do was stall. I just wanted him there as long as I possibly could have him. See, I'm just loving him. And he said, "You were driving too slowly on the thruway, and you'll have to drive on an ancillary road if you're going to drive this slow." And he said, "I understand it's an old car." And then he finished. He decided not to give me a ticket, and then that routine was over. Now, see, we meet in the role of state trooper and miscreant, or potential miscreant, and then we run through that one. And then what do? Because the predicament he felt was that he wasn't used to being loved that way. I mean, when a state trooper stops people, they don't usually look at him with unconditional love, And he didn't want to go away, but he didn't know what else to do. I mean, it's a tricky thing. So he said, "Great car you got there." See, that allowed us, I could get out of the car, we could kick and spit and kick the tires and say, "It's a straight 8" when they don't make them like they used to, and things like that. And he could tell me old car stories, and I could tell him old car stories. And then we ran out of that one. And I mean, I didn't care. I had the rest of my life, with the presence of this being. And then he said, "Well, be gone with you." Well, now, that isn't state trooper talk, I mean. But I learned from the 60s that you don't blow your cover. I mean, if he wants to be a state trooper, you be a citizen. That's the part you play. So I said, "Thank you, officer." And I got in my car, and I shifted down. I started to drive away, and I looked in my rearview mirror, and he walked back to his cruiser, and he was waving at me. And I thought, "Oh, come on, state troopers don't wave." He blew his cover. Now, I began to reflect about who I didn't see as God and why. Instead of